get more chalk, mosey on back to class, and then, Kris, you'll do our project. How's that sound? Don't bother answering. If you haven't gotten it by now, your choices don't matter.
I'm sorry, Kris. I'm sorry I didn't say the whole prophecy at first. I thought if I said something different, if we did something different, if we were just kind enough, perhaps by the time we got here, it would change. But no matter what we do, our fate is already decided.
Do your choices actually matter? One of the most famous lines in Deltarune appears right at the beginning of the game. No one can choose who they are in this world. Your choices don't matter. When most players see this moment for the first time, it feels like the game is establishing its main theme. It sounds like the story is saying that nothing the player does will actually affect the world. Compared to games like Undertale, where choices clearly change the story, Deltarune seems to be telling us the opposite. Hell, even in the first interaction with Susie, and probably other times in the game, we were immediately being reminded about the message. When you actually look at the events of the story, something strange starts to happen. The game keeps telling the player that their choices don't matter, yet the entire narrative revolves around characters struggling with their own freedom and control. So, instead of removing the choice entirely, Deltarune seems to be doing something much more interesting. It shifts the focus away from the player choice and instead focuses on the character autonomy. In other words, the real question of the story isn't, do choices matter? It's, who is allowed to make those choices? And the best example of this is the character we spend the entire game controlling, Kris. Throughout the entire game, the player controls Kris using the soul. Every movement, every interaction, and every decision from the player controlling them is made by us. From a gameplay perspective, this feels completely normal because that's how almost every RPG works. But in Deltarune, it quietly introduces a disturbing twist. At the end of each chapter, Kris removes the soul from their body. For a brief moment, the character we have been controlling the entire time suddenly becomes independent. Kris can walk around freely, move in ways that we cannot control, and perform actions that the player didn't choose. This moment completely changes how we understand the relationship between the player and the protagonist. In most RPGs, we and the hero are essentially the same. The player is the one making decisions and the protagonist simply acts them out. But in Deltarune, Kris clearly has their own will. We aren't guiding Kris into anything, nor are we controlling them, and those scenes where Kris removes the soul suggest something very important. Kris is actually trying to take their own autonomy back. The soul, which normally represents the player's essence in the game, starts to feel like a less heroic force and more like something that restricts Kris's freedom. Suddenly, the traditional RPG structure becomes a lot more unsettling. Instead of the hero shaping the story, the player becomes an outside force influencing someone else's life. But here's where things start to get really interesting. Everyone who has already played this game already knows that the player controls Kris. The story repeatedly shows the characters around them, however, having their own capable choices and decisions. One of the clearest examples of this is Susie. When we first meet Susie, our deuteragonist, she completely ignores the rules of the RPG system that we were meant to have. During early battles, the player can give commands, but Susie refuses to follow them. She attacks enemy on her own volition, regardless of strategy or mercy. At first, this just seems like a gameplay gimmick or a joke about her personality, but narratively, it reveals something important. Susie is the one of the only characters in the game who acts completely according to her own will. She cannot be controlled by the player, she cannot be forced into the role of a perfect hero. She makes these choices all by herself. This makes Susie an incredibly important character thematically because she represents the possibility of real autonomy in a world where many characters feel trapped by expectations and not letting game even define who she even really is. And when we compare Susie to other characters in the story, the theme becomes even clearer. Our third protagonist in the game who plays a very interesting role is Ralsei. At first glance, he seems like the most supportive and kind character in the entire game. He welcomes Kris and Susie into the Dark World and explains the prophecy and encourages everyone to work together peacefully. Compared to Susie's aggressive personality, Ralsei almost feels like the perfect NPC tutorial guy companion. But if we look at his role in the story a little more closely, Ralsei starts to represent something very different. Unlike Susie, who constantly questions things and acts on instinct, Ralsei is deeply committed to the prophecy that supposedly guides the story. From the moment we meet him, he already knows the entire legend about the heroes who must steal the Dark Fountain. He explains it pretty confidently and almost as if he knew the story all by heart. In other words, Ralsei believes the script of the story. He believes that Kris and Susie and himself are destined to play specific roles and are meant to save the world by a standpoint. On the surface, this sounds comforting. The idea that there is a clear path of saving the world is something many RPGs rely on. But when we think about it in the context of Deltarune's themes, it raises some important questions. If the prophecy dictates exactly what the heroes must do, then how much freedom do they really have? Ralsei's perspective suggests a world where the story already knows how it should end. The heroes are simply meant to follow the instructions given to them. Their role is to cooperate with the narrative rather than question it. This makes Ralsei very different from Susie. Where Susie represents chaotic independence, Ralsei represents faith and structure of the story itself. He trusts the legend, trusts the system, and believes that everything will work out as long as the characters follow the rules they were given. Because of this, Ralsei can almost be seen as a kind of shepherd for the narrative. He gently guides the party back toward the expected path whatever things need to start drifting away from it. For example, Ralsei constantly encourages peaceful solutions during battle, reinforcing the idea that the hero should act like traditional RPG protagonists. He reminds the group about their quest and to keep focusing on sealing the Dark Fountains. None of this make him a villain, of course. In fact, Ralsei's kindness and optimism make him one of the most likable characters in the game. And we already are aware in the game that Ralsei seems to be very against and afraid about the idea itself. We see in Chapter 4 how much he is in support of the idea, and that he keeps hoping there is another way, but his confidence on it is a lot more lower than Susie's. Symbolically, he represents something important, the comfort of following a predetermined role. Some people are happy to believe that their purpose in life is already decided for them, that if they simply follow the right path, everything will make sense in the end, even if the fate itself ends up being wrong. Ralsei embodies that mindset. In a world where so many characters are trying to escape control, Ralsei stands out as someone who believes in that structure that binds them together. And this creates a fascinating tension within the story, because if Deltarune ultimately is about reclaiming autonomy, then the prophecy itself might just be another system that limits the character's freedom. It faces the whole world in black and white, dictating how the story should go, which raises an unsettling possibility. What if the greatest obstacle of the characters isn't a villain at all? What if it's the idea that their lives have already been written for them? Earlier, I mentioned that Susie acts independently from the player, especially in early battles where she refuses to follow commands, but the more the story goes on, the more it becomes clear that Susie isn't just a rebellious character for comedic effect. In many ways, Susie embodies freedom. When we first meet her, she completely rejects the structure of the story. She doesn't even care about the prophecy. She doesn't care about being a hero, and she doesn't care about anything, like following me through until she finally trusts us. But over time, something really interesting happens. Susie actually ends up growing. And what's important about the growth is that of how it happens. It isn't just influence from us and being centered around them. It isn't dictated by the prophecy. It happens because Susie slowly begins forming a genuine connection with the people around her. through her friendship with Kris, her interactions with Lancer, and eventually her relationship with Noelle, Susie begins to change the way she sees the world. She starts learning empathy. She begins caring about others. She becomes someone who wants to protect her friends. But the key of the point here is that Susie chooses that path by herself. The prophecy never forces her to become a better person. Her development happens naturally through her own experiences. That's why Susie feels so important to the theme of Deltarune. If Kris represents the character whose autonomy is being taken away, Susie represents the opposite, someone who refuses to let the world define her on who she can be. Because of this, it's not surprising that many fans often treat Susie as one of the true main protagonists of the story alongside with Kris, probably even more than Kris from how I've seen so far. She isn't just a party member, she's one of the emotional centers around the story. And when we place Susie next to Ralsei, the contrast becomes even more interesting. We should probably start to talk more about the prophecy now that we're at it. So now we're left with a strange situation. The narrative itself seems to lean forward with the idea of the original prophecy, but the deeper we look into the actual prophecy, the less perfectly it seems to line up with the assumption. And that's where things start to become fascinating from a storytelling perspective, because it almost feels like the game is presenting two layers of the narrative at the same time. There's the version of the story where the characters believe that they are living in one, where the three heroes follow the prophecy and save the world together, and we can clearly see that the legend is describing something slightly different and with different outcomes. The game never fully resolves the tension yet. Instead, it quietly leaves the contradictions sitting in the background, almost like a puzzle waiting to be solved, which raises very interesting questions about the way Toby Fox is constructing this narrative. If the prophecy we were originally told doesn't perfectly match the one we were later to see, then why was the story framed that way in the first place? Why present the trio as the clear heroes if the legend itself might be more complicated than that? At this point in the story, we still don't have the full answer, but the existence of that contradiction suggests something important. The narrative of Deltarune might not be as straightforward as the prophecy originally made it seem. And that says a lot about what the messaging of Toby's narrative is going to be about. And if the prophecy itself isn't telling the complete truth about who the heroes are supposed to be, then the story we're watching unfold might be deviating from its supposed destiny in ways we don't fully understand yet. No matter what anyone else's say, I don't think Toby would get out of his way to prove this idea wrong. There is definitely an interpretation of how he is writing the story and why he is emphasizing autonomy so focusingly like this. At this point, someone might ask an important question. If all of this is already obvious in the story, then what exactly is the point of bringing it up? How does this relate back to our own choices? After all, many people in the community have already analyzed these characters deeply. There are tons of discussions about Kris's lack of freedom and why Susie seems to be the exact polar opposite of that, making her incredibly important for a reason. But I think the real question we should be asking isn't just who lacks freedom. The real question is how the story treats that lack of freedom in general. And when you look closely, the narrative consistently portrays control, manipulation, and a deep predetermined fate as something deeply negative. We aren't meant to celebrate it. We're meant to feel uncomfortable with it. The game constantly shows us characters who are suffering because their lives are being controlled by forces outside of their control. If we want a really good example of this, I think a really good topic to talk about is Noelle. There is clearly something important going on as these chapters keep going on. We're starting to see how important of a role she plays despite not being a part of most of the Dark World shenanigans in these recent chapters. She lives in a situation where she's constantly under pressure to behave a certain way, since her family seems to hold a lot of power and influence of her mother being a mayor. Carol is strongly implied to be extremely strict and controlling, creating an environment where Noelle feels like she has to meet very high expectations. Because of this, Noelle struggles with confidence and often hesitates to express her own desires. She worries about disappointing others and tends to follow directions rather than asserting herself. This makes her one of the most emotionally vulnerable characters in the game. that is another instance of how choices or freedom seem to be the main focus of it too. I also kind of think it is kind of strange that no one seems to be bringing up Carol a lot anywhere else. Even if we do barely know anything else about the Holiday family, it is safe to assume that from what we know of her so far, and what we can expect more in future chapters to come, is that the narrative seems to be villainizing her, painting her to be an antagonist alongside with the knight. If we assume, of course, Carol even is the knight, which that is a whole can of worms that I can't be talking about today. And it's even crazier to think about too, because it's not only just Noelle who is affected by this, but in some way or form, Kris seems to also be having strings being pulled by Carol herself, and by extension, the soul, if we assume that she has something planned for us moving forward. In the Snowgrave route, or, well, what people call these days the Weird route, Noelle's vulnerability is exploited during this route. The player begins giving Noelle direct commands, a different path in the game where it turns horrific. At first, instructions seem harmless, but they gradually become more disturbing. Noelle clearly hesitates and expresses discomfort, yet she continues to follow the player's orders anyway. The reason this route feels so disturbing isn't just because of the violence that happens, it's because we are watching someone lose their autonomy. Noelle's story becomes horrifying of an example of what happens when someone is manipulated so completely that they stop trusting their own judgment. And the game makes it very clear that this is not something we're supposed to feel good about. Even outside of the Dark World, the theme continues through Carol still. Speaking of Noelle's mother, by the way, maybe we should move this focus on someone who might be similar, since we don't really have much of an explanation or conversation about her, a character very similar, and that is Queen from Chapter 2. At first glance, Queen just seems like another funny Deltarune villain. She's chaotic, dramatic, obsessed with the internet. I don't really care what she does, but once you really start paying attention to what she's actually doing in the story, Queen becomes something much more interesting. Because Queen is another character who tries to control Noelle and what her life is supposed to be. Throughout Chapter 2, Queen repeatedly pressures Noelle into becoming stronger. She tries to force her into opening a dark fountain, and she constantly frames it as something that will make Noelle better. She treats Noelle in very strange mixture of kindness and manipulation, calling her affectionate names like Sweetie while simultaneously trying to force her into decisions she clearly doesn't want to make. Queen is trying to not hurt Noelle. I do believe that she's definitely not. But she absolutely believes she knows that what's best for her, and that idea should sound very familiar, because it mirrors exactly of how her mother is treating her in the light world. Noelle is visibly nervous around her. Even other characters suggest that Carol's rigid personality may be harmful to Noelle's emotional well-being. So when you compare these two characters side by side, something really interesting starts to appear. Queen and Carol both represent authority figures who believe control over equal protection. They both think that they are helping Noelle by making decisions for her. Queen wants to make Noelle strong enough by forcing her into power. Carol wants to protect Noelle by controlling the environment around her. In both cases, the intention may not be evil, but the result is still the removal of Noelle's autonomy. And the narrative very clearly frames that as a problem. In fact, I think there's an entire arc of Chapter 2 that builds towards Noelle finally standing up for herself and telling Queen that she doesn't want to follow her orders anymore. That moment is incredibly important because it's one of the first times we see Noelle actively reject someone on deciding her future. Queen actually backs down when this happens. She realized that forcing Noelle isn't the right answer and she needs to let her go. And that's really interesting narratively because it almost feels like a practical version of the conflict Noelle may eventually have with her real mother. Honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised to see if this whole arc in Chapter 2 comes up as something important later in other chapters that Noelle might have to do at some point. There's a video made by Daryl Talks Games that already has done something incredibly similar with their analysis on Noelle. I highly recommend watching it because it really delves really deep into the whole topic by itself. But the narrative repeatedly shows that taking away someone's ability to choose their own path causes harm. Deltarune is just not celebrating control. It's showing us again and again why the loss of freedom is damaging to the people inside its world, and when we put all these examples together, a clear pattern starts to emerge. Over and over again, the narrative shows us that characters whose lives are shaped by forces beyond their control are bad, and every single time the result is portrayed as tragic. The characters are not happier because someone else is writing their story, they're suffering because of it, which leads to a more powerful conclusion. Take the prophecy by itself, for example. In a traditional fantasy story, a prophecy about heroes saving the world is usually treated as something heroic or inspiring. It gives characters a purpose and direction, it reassures the audience that everything is happening for a reason. But in Deltarune, the prophecy feels strangely unsettling. Yes, it tells the three heroes will rise to seal the dark fountains and restore balance of the world, but it also suggests that the characters' lives have already been decided for them, their actions already predicted, their future already been written. But it still frames it like a prompt. And the story is already showing us that if we keep following down this path, that something eventually horrible will happen. One of the clearest examples of this are secret bosses in the game. Jevil and Spamton are one of the most strangest figures, but the more we learn about them, the more tragic their stories become. Jevil, for example, was once just another Darkner living peacefully with others. However, he learned something about the nature of this world that completely changed his perspective. After discovering the truth, Jevil became convinced that the world itself was meaningless. He began to see everything as a kind of game where rules didn't matter anymore. This is why he constantly talks about freedom and chaos. Jevil claims that the world itself is just a game and he can do whatever he wants, in his own words at least. He believes that he is the only one who is truly free, but the way the story presents him doesn't make the freedom look very empowering. Instead, it looks terrifying. Jevil is isolated from everyone else, and he's locked away because of the other characters see him as a dangerous and unstable man. His idea of freedom isn't portrayed as a healthy independence. It's portrayed as a kind of madness that came from learning something his mind couldn't handle. In other words, Jevil represents what happens when someone becomes aware that their life might be controlled by forces they cannot escape. Spamton's story is even more tragic because he started out as a small-time salesman who desperately wanted success. For a brief moment, it seemed like he had finally achieved his dream. He became incredibly popular, gained wealth and attention, and believed that he can finally become a big shot, but the success didn't come from his own freedom. It came from a mysterious phone call that it guided him towards success. When those calls suddenly stopped, Spamton's entire life collapsed. His fame disappeared, his business failed, and he was left alone with the realization that his success might never have been his own. Spamton's obsession with becoming a big shot isn't really about fame or money, it's about freedom. Throughout his story, he constantly talks about breaking free from the strings that control him. When he finally transformed into Spamton Neo, his body is literally designed like a puppet hanging from wires. The symbolism here is impossible to ignore. He sees himself as a puppet whose life has been controlled by someone else, and when he desperately tries to break free from those strings, the result is chaos and tragedy. Even the aftermath of his fight reinforces the idea. When the battle ends, Kris doesn't celebrate at all. Instead, the game strongly implies that Kris is disturbed by what he just witnessed. Spamton's desperate attempt to escape control wasn't inspiring, it was heartbreaking. If the story keeps showing us that control and predetermined fate causes pain, fear, and instability, then maybe the point isn't that choices don't matter. Maybe the point is that losing your ability to choose is one of the worst things that can ever happen to someone. We're supposed to want these characters to break free. We're supposed to want them to find their own paths. In other words, we're not meant to accept that loss of autonomy. We're meant to root against it. One more character I kinda wanted to delve into that really reinforces the idea of why choices actually matter is definitely Gerson himself. At first, he might not seem like a major part of the main narrative, and compared to the main trio, he doesn't go on adventures or fight enemies. but he is also one of the main primary characters of the game that doesn't believe in the prophecy itself as well. He thinks that it shouldn't be taken seriously and that words shouldn't be taken by heart at all. What makes Gerson so important is the way he talks about stories. He is also just the main mentor that Susie needed after all. Throughout his appearances, Gerson is portrayed as someone who understands how narratives work. He's written books about heroes and legends, and he treats stories almost like living things that can change depending on how people involve him in them. Unlike characters who believe the future is already fixed, Gerson speaks about stories in a way that suggests that they are shaped by the actions of the characters inside them. Their perspective becomes especially meaningful when we think about the larger conflict between prophecy and the autonomy that the game keeps hinting at. If the prophecy truly dictates every outcome of the story, then there wouldn't be much room for characters to shape their own paths. Everything would already be decided in advance, but the way Gerson talks about stories suggests something different. The direction of the story can change depending on the choices people make within it. In other words, even if the overall structure of the narrative exists within the way it unfolds can still be influenced by the characters themselves. And this is where Gerson's philosophy about stories becomes so relevant, and why he acts as a good mentor to Susie. If stories are shaped by people inside them, then characters like Susie have the power to change what the story becomes. Even if the prophecy describes a certain path, the individuals living within that world can still influence how that path unfolds. So, while the player may not have full control over the direction of the game, the characters themselves clearly still possess the ability to affect their own narrative. And when we look at the story through that lens, Susie becomes incredibly important. Because if anyone in this world is capable of changing the course of the story itself, it's probably the character who refuses to let anyone else decide who she's supposed to be. Which means that even if the prophecy claims the future is already written, the narrative keeps giving us examples of the characters whose actions prove that the story might still be able to change. At this point, I could honestly keep going on. There are so many characters and plot threads in Deltarune that reflect this same idea that freedom and personal choice matter within the world of the story. The more you look at the cast, the more you start to notice how many characters are struggling with control, expectations, or the feeling that their lives are being directed by something else. In fact, I haven't even gotten to one of the most interesting parallels yet on December Holiday. From what we know so far, December's situation seems incredibly similar to Susie's personality. Both characters appear to stand outside of the expectation placed on them, both seem to be rebellious and adventurous. There's a lot of potential there to explore how those two characters might mirror each other and what that might mean for the story. There are a lot of bigger pictures of something very clear here. This theme of autonomy and freedom isn't limited to just one character arc. It shows up everywhere. When you add all of these elements together, it becomes hard to ignore the pattern. The narrative of Deltarune keeps returning to the same central conflict of the struggle. And that raises an important question. If this theme keeps appearing across so many characters and storylines, then it's very unlikely to be accidental. Toby Fox clearly understands what he's doing with these ideas. The story wouldn't keep framing control as something tragic if the concept of choice wasn't important to the world he's building. But if Deltarune cares so much about the idea of choice for its characters, why does the game keep insisting that our choices as a player don't matter? Why does it constantly distance us from that freedom? And why does the game treat the player so differently from the characters inside the story? The game repeatedly reminds us that the story isn't ours, it places the player in control of Kris. Instead of encouraging the player to shape the world, the narrative seems to push us into the strange position where we are influencing events while simultaneously being told that we aren't meant to. So even though the world of Deltarune clearly values autonomy for its characters, the player is placed outside of that system. If the story truly believes that freedom matters, then the fact that the player is constantly denied that freedom means something. Why does the game treat us so badly if they aren't supposed to have any? If this story criticizes control and predetermined fate, then why doesn't the game simply portray the player as the main villain? But I feel like a lot of people misunderstand that a lot. Instead, I think the narrative spreads this theme of the control across the entire game. The point isn't that the player is responsible for the loss of freedom in this world. The point is that the systems of control exist everywhere. If Toby only wanted to say that we are bad, the story would probably look very different. It would constantly point fingers at the player and frame every negative outcome as something that we personally caused. But instead, the narrative seems much more interested in exploring how control works as a broader concept. Let's go back into talking about the weird root, shall we? The existence of this route raises a really important question. Why is this path the player villainized on? If Deltarune truly wanted to say that the player's choice never mattered, then this route probably wouldn't exist at all. The game could simply force every one of us down the same storyline and remove the possibility of doing anything differently. But this isn't what happens. Instead, the weird route is a hidden path behind a very specific set of actions that we must discover on our own. You can't stumble into it accidentally. In fact, the game almost seems to resist you at first. To begin the route, you have to deliberately choose dialogue options that feel unnatural. You have to repeatedly pressure Noelle into doing things she clearly doesn't want to do. And at several points in this route, the game even gives you opportunities to stop and return to the normal path. In other words, the game makes you work for it. This is important because it shows that while the game claims that your choices don't matter, you can still push against the boundaries of the narrative if you try hard enough. The weird route proves that it is possible for the player to alter the story in a significant way, but the only way to do it is by forcing someone else's autonomy away from them. And that's where the route becomes a kind of reflection of the story's larger themes. Because in a strange way, the weird route mirrors the same dynamic that exists between the player and Kris. Just like Noelle's being forced into action she doesn't want to take, Kris is also being forced to follow commands that may not reflect their own choices. The route almost feels like a meta-commentary on control by itself. It shows us that it looks like that from the perspective of the person being controlled, and that this creates a very interesting contradiction of that, right? Even though the game explicitly tells us that our broader choices don't matter, it still allows us to break free the fundamental rules it set up in the first place. Throughout the game, we're constantly told that the story will continue the same way no matter what we do. The narrative pushes the idea that we're only here to experience the events rather than change them. But the moment the weird route becomes a possibility, we are suddenly able to push against those boundaries in a very extreme way. And the game doesn't stop us. If anything, it almost challenges us to see whether we're willing to go that far. That detail is really important, because if Toby Fox truly didn't want the players to take that path, he simply wouldn't have included it in the game at all. The game might claim that our choices don't matter, but the existence of an alternate path like this proves that the story is still exploring the consequences of our actions. The game does not have something to say about the player's choice, even if it is present in those choices in a negative light. But even outside of the weird route, the game still keeps proving that the player has influence over what happens. Characters consistently notice when something about Kris feels different, and dialogue options throughout the game hints that people can sense when Kris is acting strangely or making decisions that don't feel like their own. This implies that we, as a presence inside Kris, is something that actually affects how the world reacts. So even small choices can change the way scenes play out. Characters respond differently depending on how we interact with them. Certain moments in the story shift depending on how the player behaves. None of these choices completely rewrite the main plot, but they still show that we have actions that are influencing the experience in meaningful ways. And the game itself even acknowledges the strange relationship between us and Kris. It clearly understands that our choices exist. The game constantly references the player's presence, reacts to decisions we make, and even allows us to break the narrative in extreme ways. I mean, isn't it kind of weird how, despite having limited choice in the game, we are able to still talk about how the light world characters that we recognize in Undertale are somehow options we can say to them? This leads to a much heavier implication, however, when we think about it from the player's perspective. Because if we truly don't have control, and the characters inside the story are also struggling against predetermined fate and control, we aren't separate from them anymore. We're trapped alongside them. The world of Deltarune constantly shows characters trying to push against roles that were chosen for them. Even if the story is confronting the same problem, they are living in a world where their choices might not truly belong to them. So if the player is also being told that their choices don't matter, then the situation becomes much more complicated than it first appears. It means that we aren't some all-powerful god. Instead, we might just be another part of the system. Another participant inside a narrative that none of us fully control. In a strange way, that idea creates a connection between us and the characters. We're not just controlling them from the outside. We're experiencing the same frustration as they are. The same feeling that the story might already be written before any of us can change it. And when you look at it in that way, the message becomes surprisingly bleak. Because if no one in this world truly has freedom, and not even the player, everyone is stuck inside the same structure. No one escapes it. But there's still hope. Even though Deltarune constantly shows us a world struggling with control, the story never completely abandons the idea that things can change. In fact, the more the narrative explores these darker ideas, the more it seems to empathize why freedom matters so much in the first place. Characters who feel trapped, people who feel powerless, and everyone who feels afraid and confused of where the story will go next. Showing us characters will refuse to accept that. Again and again, people in the world push back the choices that they were given. They make choices that surprise everyone around them. They form connections that change the direction of the story in ways that weren't expected. Even if the story has a structure, that structure isn't completely unbreakable. Small decisions can still reshape what happens next. The bleakness we see throughout the story might not exist to tell us that freedom is impossible. Instead, it might exist to show us why the fight for freedom matters so much. That message becomes much more hopeful. What we can only do now from this point forward is for us to make the best choices possible, to push alongside with them and continue to stay determined. Because the story isn't over just yet. That was the longest video I ever worked so hard to produce. It really drained it out of me. I promise to do more short-sized essays from now on. I wanted to make this because Deltarune became a very big game that would shape my life so meaningfully and impacted me all the way through middle school. The game means a lot to me, more than just something I played for fun. My best friends today are people I originally met online because of Deltarune. So when I say Deltarune is one of my favorite games ever made, I really mean it. But not just because of everything else, it's because of basically it being my whole identity. I hope I get to make more videos like this in the future. I'd love to keep talking about the story as more chapters release, because I genuinely love this game so much. So if you enjoyed the video, expect to see some Deltarune content in the future. I already have a few ideas for videos that I might work on, maybe some theories on the side. Credits are due to my pal Charlie for helping voice Ralsei in the beginning for the video, alongside with Gooby for voicing Susie. All of them will be credited down in the description, alongside with all the other footage that I need to give credit for. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. See you guys next time.